others I had.
Oh, yeah, it'd be like 10 degrees.
Yes, well, they were little, they were, and they were in a cute, they were just little.
Is a question about the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the first compendium of Jewish law that was put into writing after the Tanakh. And it covers all areas of Jewish law, from A to Z. There's a special volume that talks about Shabbat, about the Sabbath. A special volume that talks about Passover. Every holiday, including Purim, has its own tractate, its own book that details all the laws of that holiday. There's one notable exception, and that is there is no section of the Mishnah that talks about, okay, so the rabbis didn't want to add more oil to the fuel, to the fire, to put in more things about rebellion and about ideas that are antithetical to the Romans. Anyhow, this is a theory. I can't vouch for it. It's not a definitive answer. Another answer is a simpler answer, that the Mishnah was written contrary to the way that Judaism operated until then. Until then, Judaism operated, you had the Bible, the written text, and the rest had to be transmitted orally, from teacher to student, from father to son, and so on. So when they finally wrote the Mishnah, it was because there was no other way of preserving the wealth of knowledge, because Jews are going to become scattered at this point, and they're not going to have a close connection to the academies that promoted and taught these teachings. So it was an emergency situation to write down to put the Mishnah into writing. But if things were well known, there was no need to put it into writing. Hanukkah was a very well-known holiday. Everyone knew it because it was the most recent holiday at the time that the Mishnah was written, so there was no need to put it into writing. That's another possibility. The most plausible answer is the one that the Rabbi cites, that when I mentioned before that the Mishnah was the first work written after the Bible, that's not totally true. There was another work, a very small work, a few pages, that was put into writing that's quoted by the Talmud, and that's called Megillat Ta'anit, the Scroll of Fasting. It listed all the happy days in the Jewish calendar, days in which miracles happened. And among those different days, it includes Hanukkah. And it goes into brief detail about the laws of the lighting of the menorah of Hanukkah. So once it was already put into writing, there was no need to put it in the Mishnah. There's another answer given, which is very problematic, and it has been pointed out that it's problematic. The author of the Mishnah was Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince. His lineage traced back to King David. When he wrote the Mishnah, he was very upset at the heroes of Hanukkah because they didn't install a leader, a king, who was a descendant of King David. They were Kohanim, I mentioned this last week, they were priests, and they should not have arrogated to themselves the position of the monarchy. And that's why they were ultimately punished. Nachmanides says they were all wiped out by Herod because they violated that law that a Kohen is not supposed to be a monarch, and leadership should be passed down to the descendants of King David. Since Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was a descendant of King David, he was upset at the Maccabees, at the Hasmonean, the Hasmoneans, and he left their story out of the Mishnah. This is a teaching attributed to one of the greatest 19th century rabbis, known as the Chassam Sofer, and everyone after him says he couldn't have possibly said such a thing as that. Why would you penalize a Jewish holiday because you are upset at something that the Hasmoneans did wrong? You're going to punish the holiday? It doesn't make any sense. So I'd like to say that maybe he meant something else that has the opposite connotation. The reason why the Mishnah had to be written was because of exile conditions. When Jews were driven into exile, they no longer had the luxury of being able to sit and study at the feet of the greatest masters, where everyone is learning from everyone who's teaching. Things are going to become very difficult. And if you wouldn't put it into writing, it would be forgotten. Why would the Torah be forgotten? And the answer to that is because it was an exile condition. If the Jews had not been thrust into exile, we wouldn't need the writing of the Mishnah. We would have everything committed to memory. What caused the exile conditions? The Hasmoneans taking power and not giving it over to a descendant of King David, which would have marked the beginning of the Messianic age. I mentioned this last week, that everything in Hanukkah was ripe for the Messianic age, because they had independence, they had the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. They were only missing one ingredient, and that was they didn't have the Mashiach. Judaism is predicated on a belief, not in a Messianic age that comes by itself, but a Messianic age has to be ushered in by the Mashiach, the leader of the Jewish people, who's a descendant of King David. And therefore, when that was undermined, they didn't appoint someone from King David. The Second Temple era was just an extension of exile, was the forerunner of a new exile, which necessitated putting the words of the Mishnah into writing. So Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, when he leaving Hanukkah out of the Mishnah, he was trying to say, if Hanukkah had been complete, if they would have taken the lesson of Hanukkah to its legitimate conclusion, there would have been no need to put it into writing. Hanukkah transcends exile conditions, and if it wasn't for the fact that they messed up a little, there would be no need to put it into the Mishnah. Another question. This is the most famous question in Judaism. This question was first asked by a rabbi from the Provence, the southern part of France, known as the Meiri. The word Meiri comes from the word light. Meir, Meiri, one who gives off light. It's interesting that the person who asked this question's name is associated with light. And this question was asked by him about 700 years ago. And then it was asked again by someone who wasn't aware of the earlier rabbi, Rabbi Yosef Karo. Rabbi Yosef Karo was the author of the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch, and he was the most famous Sephardic rabbi in his time. He fled Spain during the time of the Inquisition, and he set up shop in the city of Tzfat in northern Israel. And he became the most celebrated rabbi in the Sephardic Jewish community and respected by everyone for his greatness and his learning and piety and so on. And he asked this question as well. And it's interesting that he asked the question because his name connected to Hanukkah. When do we celebrate Hanukkah? Around the time of the year that we read about Joseph. What does Joseph mean? What does the word Joseph mean? To increase. One of the lessons of Hanukkah is that you never stay in one place. You always have to increase light. The first night we light one, then we add on 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's providential that the question was asked and is attributed to Rabbi Yosef Karo, who wrote a book called Beit Yosef, the House of Joseph. And this is the question. Why do we observe Hanukkah 8 days? Hanukkah should really be a 7-day holiday because they had enough oil for one day, for one night. The miracle was that it lasted 8. If you do the simple math, that means the miracle was a miracle that endured for 7 days. So we should have a 7-day holiday. Why an 8-day holiday? Now this question was asked, and to this day, there probably is way given to this question. Some answers are simple answers, and they are plausible, and some are just different ways of reading into the whole story of Hanukkah, bringing new ideas into it, using this as a hook for those ideas. So I'm going to share some of those answers that were given. If anyone thinks of an answer, please raise your hand. If anyone thinks they have their own answer.
Well, I think that by not just acknowledging that the 7-day worth of oil, but just to have the initial oil is also a miracle. It's also
okay. That's one of the answers. It's going to be hard to find a new answer, but it's possible. So let me share some of the answers. That year, the Maccabees were fighting, and they didn't observe the holiday of Sukkot, which is an 8-day holiday. And it's the most joyous of all the biblical holidays. And they felt that they missed something very crucial. So when they were able to liberate the temple, they re-celebrated this holiday of Sukkot. They said, okay, we didn't do it in the proper time, but let's do it now. Let's create a holiday that replaces the joy of the holiday of Sukkot, which is an 8-day holiday. So they also kept this for 8 days. That's one of the answers given. Also, as we mentioned last week, one of the few things that initially that the Greeks outlawed was circumcision. That was a horrible decree because circumcision is so fundamental to being Jewish. So when they were able to liberate the temple and they had the freedom and were able to reinstate circumcision, they decided to celebrate a holiday of 8 days corresponding to the 8 days in which circumcision takes place. It's another answer. A third answer, we celebrate Hanukkah for 2 reasons. Number one, the victories, the military victories. Chronologically speaking, that came first. And then the miracle with the cruse of oil that lasted for 8 days. So while the cruse of oil miracle is celebrated by lighting the menorah for 7 days, you still have to celebrate the victory. You can't just ignore the victory. So the first day of Hanukkah, the first night and day of Hanukkah, the focus is on the victory. They just came fresh off the battlefield victorious. So we celebrate that the first day. The next 7 days commemorate the miracle of the cruse of oil. Yes?
What about 8 in Judaism? 7 is a week, 7 is special, is the whole world. 8 is supernatural.
Right.
And what happened was a supernatural miracle.
Okay. That's right. That's one of the answers. But the problem with that answer is Passover is also a celebration of a miracle, and it's only a 7-day holiday in Israel and in the Bible. So why isn't that 8 days? Why is Hanukkah more than Passover?
That only God can answer.
And I'm not suspecting anyone here is God.
8 is also the number of God's covenant, isn't it? I mean,
That's circumcision, yes. That's right. Some say, as you just answered before, that the first day we celebrate the miracle of finding the cruse of oil, because oil was stored, I think I discussed this in the first class, oil was stored in one special chamber, and all the oil there was contaminated. Where did they find this cruse of oil? In the sanctuary. That was never a place where they stored oil. How does a cruse of oil end up in the sanctuary? It's like finding you can think of some odd thing in a place where you never expect it to be found. And not only that, but it was sealed with the seal of the high priest. The high priest had more important things to do than to seal jugs of oil. You didn't need his seal, and he never sealed jugs of oil, high priest. At some point, we don't even know which high priest, when it happened. At some point, he decided, you know what? I'm going to seal a jug of oil with my seal and leave it in the sanctuary. That itself was a miracle. Another answer given is that when they took the oil out of the jug and poured it into the menorah, the jug should have been empty. And they looked at the jug, it was still full. So the first day, they already saw the miracle. They didn't have to wait till the next day to see that the oil was still there. They saw the oil was still there when they emptied out the jug of oil. Another answer, we don't really know exactly what happened there, how it happened. So we can only speculate. So some speculation is they knew they're not going to get a fresh supply of oil for 8 days, because it would take a few days of traveling to the place where the oil was produced, a day to produce the oil, and a few days to return. They didn't know that they're going to get oil until 8 days. So what did they do the first night? Did they pour all the oil into the menorah and say, well, we're not going to be able to do it the next 7 days? Or did they say, you know what, let's divide the oil into 8 parts. So at least every night until we get a fresh supply, it'll burn a little bit. Not the whole night, because it's supposed to burn all night. It'll burn a little part of the night, a fraction of the night. That's what they thought would be the best way to accommodate the requirement of lighting the menorah, that not missing even a single day. But what happened was, instead of it burning only a fraction of the night, it lasted all night. So every one of the 8 nights, the oil, even though it was a small amount, was sufficient to last all night. Another answer is that when they lit the menorah the first 7 nights, 7, as you said before, is the symbol of nature. There are 7 days of the week, 7 days of creation. One of the nights that we light the menorah is to reflect on nature itself. You think nature is not miraculous. You think nature is not divine. The miracle of the 8th day proved that nature itself is also just as divine as the miracle. The only difference between a miracle and nature is that nature is a constant miracle. Anything that's constant doesn't get us excited. The fact that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west doesn't get us excited because it happens every single day. But it's no less of a divine phenomenon than a miracle if the sun would start going the other direction, because it's just the same God who's responsible for the miracle as he is for the nature as he is for the miracle. And there are hundreds more answers. I have one book that has 100 answers in it, and I saw a book that had 500 answers. And it continues. There was a Hasidic rabbi who every night of Hanukkah would give a new answer. And he did this for many years. Yes?
Rabbi, has Hanukkah been the super special holiday that you described, that it's so holy? Has it always been that case, or did it begin with Hasidim, or did it? When?
Yes and no. Hanukkah was always observed with great devotion, but the Hasidic movement put more emphasis on it than it was celebrated previously, as Hasidic movement did to a lot of other aspects of Judaism. Let's say joy. Joy was always part of Judaism. It's in the Bible. Serve God with joy. But it was never really fully appreciated to the extent that it is through the teachings of Hasidus. And you had a question.
Do you like any of the, out of all the answers, is there one that you like the best?
That's a good question. There are hundreds of answers to that question. I just can't think of any. Why are they looking? I'll answer that question with a question. Why is there such an attempt to find an answer to this question? It's not the most troubling, usually a question that people try to deal with are troubling questions. You know, why is there evil in the world? Why is there pain and suffering? That's a question that everyone asks because it's a painful one, and it demands answers. So when people ask questions, when people ask questions, it means that they're searching for something. They're searching for a deeper understanding of what happened in Hanukkah. And it manifests itself by asking this question. And they're looking for something transcendent. And that goes back to what you said before about 8 being transcendent. People are looking for something that is transcendent. Then we're not happy with the nature, the way nature runs. And that's why people are asking the question, begging to find out the secret of 8. 8 is a very mystical number. It says that the King David's musical instrument, they call it a harp, but I doubt it was a harp, had 7 strands. When Mashiach will come, the harp, or whatever parallel instrument it is, will have 8 strands. What's the big deal of saying it's going to have one more than King David? King David could have added one more. And what's the difference between 7 and 8? 8 that's just a metaphor. It may be taken literally as well, but it's a metaphor that when Mashiach comes will be connected to the 8. And that's the elusive question. When is Mashiach coming? When are we going to finally be able to break out of the mold that keeps the world in its natural state, subject to the pain and suffering and violence and hatred and all the terrible things that exile characterizes? We're looking to break out of that. Yes?
The fact that there are 1,000 different answers seems to give meaning that the 8th day has meaning, that it's not just another attack on it.
Right. And we're looking to find meaning in 8. And I think it's a subconscious desire to reach the 8 and break out of the 7, even as good as the 7 could possibly, because Shabbos is also 7. You can't be better than Shabbos, and we want to transcend even that. And and also every time you answer a question, if it's not a practical question about how to behave, but it's an ideological question, you're looking for an answer that resonates with you. And each answer could resonate with one group of people and not resonate with another. So everyone is looking to find meaning in their lives through the answering of the question.
Rabbi, are you familiar with that tale, the Rabbi's gift?
The what?
The Rabbi's gift. Are you familiar with that Hasidic story?
I'm not sure what story you're referring to.
It's about a Christian monastery that is in disarray. And they while walking one day, one of the monks encounters a rabbi, and the monk explains to the rabbi that they're.
And they walked into a bar, the rabbi and the monk.
He explains that the monastery is in disarray, and the rabbi says, it's interesting because I have insight into your dilemma. He says, what you do not know of the remaining 6 monks there, they're all elderly monks. One of you is Moshiach. And so when he goes back, he won't identify who it is, and then because they know one of them is Moshiach, they all begin to treat one another very well, and it infuses with selflessness and holiness and all
Okay. I never heard the story.
Muslim monastery.
Yes.
In Jewish tradition, when you speak to somebody, you ask question, and Jewish person ask question to you.
Why not?
Why? Exactly. What I'm talking about, you say 100 questions, 200, 600 questions. It's exactly why not. About how to celebrate idea, but I'm not sure, but I will ask question. What do you think? What do you think? This is first. Second, you talk now about King David, how he played harp. Did he play harp in temple on Shabbat or not?
King David did not play music in the temple at all, because King David was not a Kohen or a Levi. The Levi would play the instruments.
The temple wasn't built.
No. I talk now.
There was a provisional temple.
In temple in Shabbat at this time they play.
They were required to play on Shabbat. In the temple, it was a requirement. It was a commandment to play music.
But in some places they play music instrument.
Of course they did. Not King David. The Levites and the Kohanim blew trumpets. The Levites played other instruments. But that was part of the service in the temple, and it only applies to the temple, as do many other things. But that's off the subject. Now, we light the Hanukkah menorah, as everyone knows. We light 1 the first night, 2 the second night, and we keep on going in increasing order, in ascending order. It's not everyone agrees with that. There was a dispute between the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. Hillel lived about 100 years before the destruction of the Second Temple. Hillel and Shammai were the two spiritual leaders of the Jewish people, the heads of the Sanhedrin. And Hillel and Shammai themselves had totally different personalities, and it was reflected mostly in their students. Hillel and Shammai themselves didn't have that many disputes. Only a handful are recorded in the Talmud. But their disciples had hundreds of disputes. And one of the most famous disputes regarded the order in which we light the Hanukkah menorah. The first, his school of Hillel says 1, and we build up to 8. And the school of Shammai says we start with 8, and we go down to 1. What is the reason for this dispute? What is the logic between of these two opinions? So the Talmud gives 2 reasons. One reason is that school of Hillel first. There's a principle in Jewish law that you always have to go higher and higher in Jewish practice. You can't go from a high level to a low level. You always go high and higher. And this manifests itself in many different ways. For example, when they built the tabernacle, it was made out of planks of wood. The planks of wood that were closer to the ark represented a holier part of the temple. You couldn't put that in the back of the temple because you couldn't take something holy and make it put it in a less holy position. You always have to go higher, never go lower. So the school of Hillel says that's why you start with 1 and you keep on increasing and going higher and higher. That's the opinion of the school of Hillel. The school of Shammai says we have a biblical precedent for the opposite. During the holiday of Sukkot, they would bring 70 offerings. Each day, they would go in descending order. The first day they would bring 13, the second day 12, then 11, then 10, all the way down to 7, a total of 70. So they went in descending order. We have to follow a biblical precedent. But we have to understand what's the logic between these 2 opposite viewpoints. So one of the explanations is that the focus of Hillel and the focus of Shammai are fundamentally different. What do we want more than anything else? Do we want to get rid of evil, or do we want to promote goodness, holiness? The school of Hillel says we can't fight all the evil in the world. We can't reach all evil and eradicate it. We can't just fight every battle in the world. We don't have that ability. What we could do is bring light into the world. So every day we bring a little bit more light. Today we start off with 1 light, and tomorrow we'll do 2. And we can keep on going higher and higher. The school of Shammai says, Shammai comes from the attribute of judgment. Hillel comes from the attribute of kindness. Kindness and light are synonymous in Jewish texts. The word Hillel also comes from the Hebrew word, which means light. It's a biblical word. I think the English word halo probably comes from that as well. So Hillel is the one who focuses on bringing more and more light. Shammai, on the other hand, the word Shammai comes from a root that means to be analytical, like an accountant who counts things, who focuses on making sure everything works right, not to allow any nonsense get involved. That's what accountants do. They control the evil in the world to make sure you don't cheat on your taxes, or to make sure you do cheat on your taxes if it's a corrupt accountant. So let me just finish the thought. So Shammai, the school of Shammai says, we have to focus on getting rid of evil. Now in Hebrew, the word for light is or. The word for fire is ur. But it's really the same letters. So the school of Shammai focuses on burning the evil, getting rid of, consuming the evil. So you start off with 8, you start off with a huge amount of evil. The next day you don't have as much evil, you're down to 7 until you get to the 1. We follow the school of Hillel because we don't have that power to deal with all evil. We have to deal with evil, of course. There's no way you can escape it, but we can't just focus on that and make that our whole purpose in life, to fight evil. We have to focus more on bringing more good into the world. Who had the question?
Is there, in Judaism, do we make an analogy between both of those men in terms of that Shammai represents more the law and Hillel is justice?
No, Hillel justice would be included in law.
Because what I mean, law is the written law, and the justice is the compassion part.
Justice is not compassion. You can have justice with compassion, but justice itself is more discipline.
I see the law, the written law, the word for word.
Hillel did not try to go beyond the law. In other words, to say that I'm not going to focus on the law. I'm going to focus more on being compassionate. There's the famous story of Hillel, where the potential convert wants to be converted standing on one leg, and Shammai throws him out, and Hillel tells him what's hateful to you, don't do to your fellow. The rest is commentary, and go out and study the rest. Hillel was not going against the law. He was just, he saw into the convert that he was sincere, and that what he said, this respectful thing that he said to teach him the whole Torah on one leg, was not really his essence. So Hillel is closer to the idea of light. He was able to illuminate and see the good in that person. Shammai saw the judgment, and therefore he rejected that person. But the school of Shammai focuses on getting rid of evil. The school of Hillel focuses on increasing the light. That's one reason for the dispute. And the Talmud gives another reason. Talmud says you either go, and this is the way it's interpreted. Talmud is very cryptic, but this is how it's interpreted. The school of Hillel says, look, the first night of Hanukkah, what was the miracle? They only saw the miracle, it only lasted one night. They didn't know it's going to last another 7, so we can't celebrate more than one because we only saw one night's worth of illumination. The second night, we already are exposed to the second dimension, the second level, because we see it burning another night. Every night we have to go by what we see in actuality. The school of Shammai says, no, you have to go by the potential. The first night, in retrospect, we know the whole story now. So in the first night, that oil had enough to last 8 days. The second night, it had enough to last 7 days. The last night, it had only enough to burn one more day. So we go in an order based on the potential. And the Rabbi, in one of his discourses, shows that the school of Hillel and Shammai argue about this point, potential versus actual, in at least another 10 different places. They seem to be arguing about the same principle. And the Rabbi explains how within this dispute, there can be a multitude of different approaches. Now, Hanukkah was established. When was it established as a holiday? The miracle happened the year that it happened. It wasn't established as a holiday. Next year, the Talmud says, they said, let's make this a holiday. Why did they wait a year? If they saw the miracle and they were impressed with the miracle, they should have said, let's make this day in which the miracle happened a holiday for the future. They said, no, they waited a year. Why did they wait a year? So one of the Hasidic commentators, known as the Bnei Yissaschar, gives the following explanation. He says, a holiday in Judaism is not what it is in the non-Jewish way of looking at things. A holiday is not a day you designate to celebrate something that happened on that day. A holiday is a day in which there's spiritual energy that is generated. And that spiritual energy demands that you celebrate. So they didn't know. Not every miracle that happens is worthy of celebration and designated that day as a holiday, because it doesn't mean that that day will have that same energy in subsequent years. That's why they waited a year, and when the year passed and they felt the same energy, the same spiritual energy they had a year before, said, this is a holiday. So we don't just, it's interesting, I mentioned before that text that was written before the Mishnah, Megillah Tanis, that has a list of many holidays. All those holidays were abolished when the temple was destroyed. Except for Hanukkah and Purim, the only 2 rabbinical holidays that were not abolished were Hanukkah and Purim. All the rest, there's a few dozen other days throughout the year that are considered to be joyous days, that virtually, unless you studied that text, or it's the few places it's quoted in the Talmud, you wouldn't even know about those days. So yet they were abolished. Why were they abolished? Because they were not real holidays. They were just commemorative days that to remember the miracles. And when the temple was destroyed and the world was thrown into a period of exile, it's a little awkward to celebrate certain miracles that happened when the miracles ceased happening and people were going through very hard times with the destruction of the temple. Hanukkah and Purim were different. Hanukkah and Purim, the days themselves had special qualities, spiritual energy. So you can't abolish the day because there's other suffering, but the day itself demands that we observe it because there's something spiritual on this day. And if the average person doesn't feel the difference between one day and another, but if you are a spiritual person, you'll feel when Hanukkah comes. Even if you didn't know it was Hanukkah, you were thrown into a dungeon, there's no day or night, and you lose total knowledge of what day of the week it is, what day of the year. If you are a very spiritual person, you'll feel it's Hanukkah. It's a different day. It's a different energy. So they had to wait a year to see if that energy was there. Is it just going to be a nice event to commemorate? Or is it going to be a day in which the spiritual energy is shining brightly? And when they felt it the next year, they said, this is a real holiday. It's not just a nice day to commemorate certain things of the past. Now let's do a little bit more practical. The obligations of Hanukkah. First, the most important obligation, of course, is to light the menorah. Now, sometimes I get criticism from Israelis. It's not a menorah, it's a Chanukiah. What? It's a menorah, because the menorah simply means a candelabrum, an instrument that you can light candles or oil. So it is a menorah. But they say no, menorah is only in the temple was called a menorah. Now anything, even a Shabbos candelabrum is called a menorah. But the word, I used to laugh at the word Chanukiah, that it's a modern Israeli word, but I found sources that it was used a few hundred years ago as well, that they used the special name for the Hanukkah menorah, Chanukiah. So whatever you use is fine.
What is the word?
Chanukiah.
Hanukkah.
A Hanukkah thing. So that is the obligation that everyone, men and women, have to light in a family where there's a husband and wife. The husband lights and the wife fulfills her obligation by being present there. And if there are children, the children are encouraged to light their own as well, to educate them. Another obligation is to recite the psalms called Hillel. These are psalms that are recited in every joyous holiday. Then there's a special prayer that we recite in our prayers, our daily prayers, called Al Hanisim. And it's also said when we recite the grace after meals. You're not allowed to fast or eulogize on Hanukkah. Let's hope there won't be any need for eulogizing. So on any Jewish holiday, you're not allowed to deliver a eulogy that invites tears and sadness. Now, do you have to feast? You know, everyone knows the famous refrain, they try to kill us, we won, let's eat. So does that really apply to Hanukkah? And as you can imagine, don't be shocked that there is a dispute. Believe it or not, the rabbis disagreed about this. Maimonides seems to suggest that it is a time for feasting, but many others say no, there's no obligation. You want to feast? As we say in Yiddish, gesundheit, be my guest. But there's no obligation to feast. On Purim, there's an outright obligation to feast. Even if you're not hungry, you have to feast on Purim, on Pesach, on all the Jewish holidays. But Hanukkah, they say there's no obligation. What's the reason for the one who says there's no obligation? The one who says there's an obligation, we understand. Judaism is all about eating on happy days. But why not be obligated to feast? So they say because and why is it different from Purim? They're both rabbinical holidays. So why Purim we focus on the feasting and Hanukkah we don't? And the answer is because the objectives of the Greeks were totally different from the objectives of the enemies of the Jews during Purim. What did Haman want? He wanted to annihilate all the Jews. Haman was an honorary member of Hamas, that he wanted to genocide That's where the word genocide really makes any sense. The Jewish people. He was after their bodies. Now, I'm sure he didn't want them to be Jewish either, but the way to get rid of Judaism is to get rid of Jews. That's the simplest way of getting rid of Judaism. So the focus was on the body. So how do we celebrate? We celebrate with our bodies. We give our bodies to drink and to eat, so we can recognize the fact that the salvation was a salvation that affected our physical being. On Hanukkah, the Syrian Greeks were not against the Jews per se. They were only against Judaism. And if the Jews had surrendered to their desires, to their objectives, and they would have adopted Greek culture, they would have been left alone. They didn't destroy the temple. They could have destroyed the temple, but they didn't destroy the temple because they didn't care to destroy for the sake of destruction. When the Jews rebelled and resisted, then they started a battle and a war against the Jews and killed Jews. So the attack against the bodies of the Jews was secondary. The main objective was their spirit, was their soul. That's why we celebrate with light. Light is the closest metaphor to spirituality. If you want to use a metaphor for something spiritual, you say the light. He's enlightened. Light is the most abstract physical existence, and we focus on the light. Nevertheless, others who disagree say you should feast because even though their objective was not their bodies, it did affect their bodies as well. Now, how to light the menorah? There are two customs based on the Talmud. The Talmud talks about lighting of the menorah, and it says you should light the menorah outside of the entrance of your home so that it brings light to the outside. But that became untenable because of two reasons. Number one, most of the Jews lived in Europe where Hanukkah occurs in the winter, and if you light your menorah outside, it's not going to last very long. The conditions don't allow it to do it. And then secondly, the anti-Semites of the world, and there were many in those days and today also, unfortunately, there's a danger that they will extinguish it. They won't let you light your menorah outside. So then the question is, where do you light it? So there are two customs that developed. One custom is to focus on the publicizing of the miracle to the outside. So you put it in your window where everyone who passes by could see the menorah being lit. However, the other opinion says no, there's an advantage to putting it in your doorway, even if it's inside the house, because the original way of doing it was to put it on the left side of your doorway, because the right has a mezuzah on it. That's where you put the mezuzah, on the right side as you enter the house, and the left will be the Hanukkah menorah, so that way you're enveloped by a mitzvah. You have your right flank with the mezuzah, your left flank with the menorah, so that enhances your spirituality. Now that we have to go inside, we also put it by the door. We put the right side of the door, we have the mezuzah, and the left we have the Hanukkah menorah. So that's how we preserve it. Now, what do we light? You can light anything that burns, that doesn't extinguish easily. So it could be candles, it could be oil, it could be coconut oil, it could be any type of oil, but the preferred way of doing it is with olive oil. Why olive oil? For two reasons. One reason is that that's the way the original miracle occurred. They used olive oil in the temple and no other oil. So we want to commemorate that and try to reenact what happened there. So we try to be as close to it as they were. So we use olive oil, and also olive oil is the cleanest flame. It's the purest flame of all the different oils. And how do we light? We light people. Let's say the eighth night we put in 8 candles. We go from left to right. We light the newest one, the 8th one first, and then we go to the right, from the 8th to the 7th to the 1st. There are several differences between the Hanukkah menorah, even though it's modeled after the menorah of the temple. There are several salient differences between them. Number one, in the temple, the menorah was on the right. In our way of doing it, we do it on the left. In the temple, they lit the menorah during the day, before sunset, when it was still day. We light the menorah after dark, after sunset. in the temple, they lit it inside the sanctuary. The original way of doing the Hanukkah menorah was outside. And even though some people now do it inside, that's the Chabad custom to do it inside, we make up for that outside by having public menorah lightings, where we bring the light of the menorah to masses of people. So that way we have both, we can accommodate both interests. Yes?
You said we light at nightfall or at night. Can you tell us how to light on Friday when Shabbos comes Friday?
Okay, when Shabbos, Friday night, there's always a Friday night in Hanukkah because it's 8 days, and we have to light it before sunset, and we light it before we light Shabbat candles. But there's a little bit of a difficulty here. If you use the colored candles that are so commercialized, they only last a half hour. And that's all the Hanukkah menorah has to last, is a half hour, but it has to be a half hour after dark. So even if you light it earlier, you have to have it light longer, about an hour and a half. Because if you're lighting the Shabbos candles, usually 18 minutes before sunset, and you light the Hanukkah menorah before the Shabbos, and it has to light a half hour after the stars come out, after dark, it's about an hour and a half. So you can't use those colored candles unless they make them bigger. I don't know why they don't make them a larger size so it can burn longer. But if you don't have...
Boxes with cables for
You take a regular Shabbat candle.
for the regular day.
Right, so for Friday night, you use one of the large Shabbat candles. It doesn't make a difference. They don't have to be colored, and they don't have to be called Hanukkah candles. Any candle suffices.
You can use the tea lights also.
You could use tea lights, right. So for the Hanukkah menorah, you don't even need a menorah for the Hanukkah menorah lighting. You can just put down 8 tea lights on the 8th day of Hanukkah and light them all. And light them before sunset, and it should last at least a half hour after dark. So there are 4 differences actually between the Hanukkah menorah and the one of the temple. The Hanukkah menorah is on the left, and the temple was on the right. Number 2, day versus night. Number 3, inside versus outside. And there's a 4th one, which I didn't mention, was the menorah in the temple had 7 branches. Our menorah has 8. All these differences, the Rebbe says, are really connected to the same idea. The purpose of the Hanukkah menorah, among other things, is to illuminate the darkness. That's why we do it on the left side, because left is associated with darkness. Left is the sign of judgment, of withholding, which leads to all sorts of negatives. We're trying to illuminate the negatives. We do it at night when it's dark to illuminate the darkness. We do it outside, not ideally, it should be outside, unlike the temple menorah, which was not there to illuminate the darkness of the world per se. It's to bring more light into the world. But Hanukkah menorah is to get rid of the darkness of the world. And that's why it's 8 instead of 7, because the power to transform darkness and negativity comes from the number 8. Again, that brings us back to that idea that 8 is a transcendent number, and it can take something that's part of nature, fixed into nature, and transform it. So that explains all the differences. Now we come to the customs of Hanukkah. Eat latkes and donuts. The secret is some Jewish cardiologists got together. He says, we want to promote more business. So eat a lot of fried foods. The second explanation is the miracle happened with oil, so you fry food in oil, and that commemorates the miracle with oil. I mentioned the other explanation the other day was that the word Latkes in Yiddish means patches, because when the Greeks came into the temple, they made 13 breaches. They punched holes into one of the partitions in the temple. So as to commemorate that we had to patch those breaches, we eat patches. There's another. So why donuts? Well, donuts was baked goods were mostly introduced by Sephardic Jews. I think that's Ashkenazic Jews eat potato latkes, although it doesn't have to be potatoes. It could be anything that's fried. And donuts are more, I think, Sephardic in origin. But there's no law that says an Ashkenazi Jew can't have latkes and donuts. Just check with your cardiologist. But I saw an explanation why we eat donuts or fried dough, any dough that's fried, because when a person eats grain, unlike bread, other grains, cake and pastries and things like that, there's a blessing that you recite after finishing the meal of these pastries, in which we mention the altar in the Beit HaMikdash, the altar in the temple. One of the reasons for Hanukkah, although it's usually underplayed, is the fact that we rededicated the altar. The altar was the most important part of temple service. That's where they would bring all the sacrifices. And the altar they couldn't use because it was contaminated, so they had to create a new altar and rededicate it. And on the altar they would bring different kinds of offerings, including flour offerings. So so by eating the donuts, you mention the idea of the Mizbeach, the altar in the temple, and that reminds us of that other aspect of Hanukkah. Besides the menorah, it was also the altar. Why we don't put too much emphasis on the altar's dedication as opposed to the menorah is because Hanukkah, the main focus is on the light. Now the dreidel. Why do we play dreidel on Hanukkah? So there are many explanations given. Some say, and this is the most famous explanation given, but there's no historical evidence of this, that when the Greeks banned the study of Torah, children would go to the outskirts of town and they would study Torah amongst themselves. But when a Greek soldier would pass by, they would hide their scrolls and they would take out tops and play with it like children do, so the soldiers wouldn't be alerted to the fact that they were studying Torah. So the kids play with the dreidels, a way of reminding ourselves of how the Jewish children risked their lives to study Torah. Another explanation is that when the Hanukkah menorah burns, we're supposed to sit and watch it for a half hour. If it lasts more than a half hour, you don't have to, but for a half hour, ideally you should sit there and watch the Hanukkah menorah. So as a way of passing time while you're watching the Hanukkah menorah, they had the playing of the dreidel. But then there's a very beautiful explanation given that the 4 letters that are embossed on the dreidel, Nun, Gimel, Hey, Shin, which stands for Nes Gadol Hayasham, a great miracle happened there. In Israel, it's different. A great miracle happened here. Well, we'll take the 4 letters that we use outside of Israel. Those 4 letters represent the 4 exiles, the 4 biblical exiles that were predicted by the prophet Daniel. The 4 exiles were Babylonia, Persia, Greece, and Rome. We are still at the tail end of the Roman exile. It started with the Romans destroying the temple. Each one of those 4 exiles, of those 4 empires, had a different focus. The Babylonians destroyed the temple. They were against the Nun. Nun stands for Nefesh, or Neshama, the soul. They wanted to destroy the soul of the Jewish people, which was the temple. The Persians, who came later, Haman wanted to kill the Jews. He wanted the guf. Guf in Hebrew is body, the gimel. That's the Persians. The Greeks were not against the body, but they were against our intellect. They want to contaminate the way Jews think by having Jews be forced into Greek culture and the Greek way of looking at life. The Hebrew word for intellect, seichel, has the letter shin in it. Shin and sin are the same, identical in Hebrew. So that's the shin of the dreidel. The Romans have the hey. Hey stands for hakol, everything. Roman exile, which led the Jews into exile for the last close to 2,000 years, we went through every one of those. We had those people who wanted to destroy our soul. We had the people that wanted to destroy our bodies, and we still have them. We have people who wanted to destroy our minds. So that's hakol, that's everything. And I would like to add that the Roman exile did also something to get rid of our hergish, our feelings. to desensitize us. That's what the Roman exile, the last exile we're in, has caused the desensitization of the people, that we're not sensitive anymore to spirituality. We're not sensitive anymore to the same things the Jews were sensitive for in the days of the temple.
I assume that the Roman exile is the longest exile?
Yes, it is. It's close to 2,000 years. The Persian exile was between the Babylonian and Persian, we're talking of Babylonian, was 70 years. Persian lasted a little longer, into the days of the Second Temple. And what is the dreidel? When you spin the dreidel, it means all these four empires are swirling around, and they all crash land. They're all coming to an end. The Jewish people represent the point of the dreidel. The point of the dreidel always remains intact. We will never be destroyed. And the letters Nun Gimel He Shin numerically adds up to the word Mashiach. Now in Israel they have Nun Gimel He Pei, which adds up to 138. It's not Mashiach, but that's Menachem, which the Talmud says is the name of Mashiach. So either way, the dreidel represents the fall of all the empires, of all of exile, that will lead us to the final redemption. Why do we give Hanukkah Gelt? You actually give money to children on Hanukkah. It's encouraged, not chocolate money. You can give chocolate money as well, but the idea is to give them real money. You can give presents if you want, but it shouldn't be instead of the money. You give them money as well. So there are many reasons given for it. The Talmud says while you're watching the Hanukkah menorah, you can't use the light of the menorah to engage in mundane activities like counting money. So there's like a hint over there that when the Hanukkah menorah is burning, people would be tempted to count money. So you give the money to the children and you tell them, don't count the money now because the Hanukkah menorah is burning. And it's a way of saying...
Money?
What?
Every day money?
At least one day during Hanukkah, but preferably every day.
Every day.
Right. And how much do you give?
No, it's okay with me.
And it's a way of saying, Hanukkah light symbolizes the light of Torah, and when you're dealing with Torah, money has no value. So while you're giving the children money, which means that you're giving it value, you're telling them it has no value compared to Torah. In those days, poor people couldn't afford candles. So how do you give a poor person money for candles without causing them embarrassment? You give every child money, and the children of the poor will use it for the candles. It's also a reward for the Torah study. The Jewish children study Torah even under the ban of death, so we reward them by giving them money. Maimonides writes that one of the things that the Greeks did is they laid their hands upon the possessions of Israel, their money. Why do they care about their money? That was not their focus. But the Greeks, everything they did was to change the attitude of the Jewish people. They didn't throw out the oil. They contaminated it. Use the oil by all means, but use the type of oil with a Greek touch to it. By all means, use money, but don't use it for spiritual reasons. Use it for mundane reasons, for secular reasons, for immoral reasons as well. So we give money to the children and to educate children that money has value when it's used for something higher, when it's used to give charity, when it's used to buy a Jewish book, when it's used for something of higher value. Now, we're going a little later than usual, yes?
When is first night of Hanukkah? What day?
What day? It's...
No, what night? Sorry, what night? First time.
Wednesday night.
Usually day, for example, 25th.
Wednesday night.
Wednesday night.
Lights came 24th.
The 24th, at the end of the Jewish way of reckoning is the night is the next day.
Yes.
So it's the night of the this year it coincides with the secular.
Doesn't matter, it's Wednesday.
Wednesday night is the first day.
Wednesday night is the first night.
Okay. And second,
This year, yeah.
it's very important. Are you smarter than a Rabbi? It's a good question because What is it smarter?
What does it mean?
What does mean word smarter?
Are you going to be able to answer? Could you answer all the questions? We're going to have a quiz next Sunday.
It's how
Final exam for the
no, it's
semester.
how much you know, but don't mean what you are smart. It's how much you know.
I can't argue. I can't argue.
That's the right, that's the
Final
right
exam
answer.
for the entire semester. You have to study everything before.
Yes.
Okay, well, you know what? We'll do a women's role next week. It's going to take. It's a 10-minute discussion.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah. So we have to focus on why women have a special role in Hanukkah. So we'll discuss it next week, God willing, together with the test to see if you're smarter than the rabbi.
Is there any discussion about why the halacha was changed from?
Why when Mashiach comes does the Arizal say we will follow the school of Shammai? So it ties in with what I said before. Right now, we don't have the power to deal. Once he said it, everyone else follows. The Arizal, no one ever disagreed with the Arizal. Either they ignore it or they adopt it. But if the Arizal said, what? I don't think he gave a reason. No, but the rationale is that right now we don't have power to get rid of evil. So we have to focus on bringing more light, and whatever light we bring in will dispel some darkness. When Mashiach comes, we'll have the power to get rid of all evil. So we'll be able to focus on getting rid of all evil.
Do you have class on Wednesday?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
I will part of quiz. I will bring violin. I will play Hanukkah tunes.
Okay.
And if somebody know, I will give Hanukkah Gelt.
Okay. Any questions on Zoom? Okay, everyone.